So now we got a talk by John Gibbons, who's an environmental journalist who writes about climate change, sustainability, resource depletion, energy, and biodiversity. He's written for the Irish Times, the Guardian, and Village magazine. And in his articles, he's been very critical of the Irish government's policy and attitude towards climate change, and in particular the Department of Agriculture. So he's going to talk today about meat consumption and its link to climate change.
Great, thanks Martin. Hello everybody. Now, everybody cheats. Use the old picture, don't update it, And then they meet you and say, Jesus, what the hell happened to you? So anyway, this is the one they keep using the paper. So anyway, as Martin said, kind of places that I show up in would be, I suppose, domestically, mostly the Irish Times, Phoenix pretty regularly, well, every issue, the Guardian, Village, and more recently, DSMOG, which is an investigative website looking mostly at climate denial, which is UK and American based. And so I suppose that's probably as good a place to start as anywhere. This is a New Yorker cover from some time back, which I suppose is, looking at, if you like, well, it's pretty self-explanatory if you think of the Earth's resources. So I suppose often when you start out doing, most of us start with a Google search for whatever it is. So, one of the topics I'd look at would be, say the 10 hottest years in recent times, that kind of thing. And as you know, Google does this thing where it autofills, so you start typing, right? So I decided to do that. And I guess what that taught me very quickly, food did make it down here, but what it taught me very quickly is that what people are looking for on Google, it certainly isn't to do with climate environmental issues. I think that's pretty clear. So I suppose here's a headline from the Washington Post from about a year or two ago, and I think it's worth now. My normal talks are on climate change, so I do an awful lot of stuff on that. So I'm going to skim around it, and I'm not going to make any assumptions, but I still think it's a hell of a headline, right? What we're doing has no parallel in 66 million years, right? It's a sort of a wowzer. So turning that into things that we can actually get our heads around. I don't know if anybody's familiar with or have seen these slides before. I'll show you a third one here. Sorry, I don't know how good or bad the quality is in that. Is that a bit dark? Can you see it? Can anybody know what's going on? I'll take it back actually to the previous one. This is in a province in China where the farmers are hand pollinating. All the flying pollinators are dead and they're not coming back. So if you're looking at the ghost of agriculture future, that's what we're looking at, hand pollination. So just a brief detour on that. It was a German study that was published that discovered between 1979 and 2012, 78% of all the flying insects in Germany disappeared in 25 years. 78%. That's over 3/4 of all the flying insects in 25 years gone. And just remember, these flying insects have been flying for hundreds of millions of years. We're in a very strange moment in Earth history. Not just in human history, in Earth history. We're in a really weird moment. So, as I say, this is what's coming. I'm going to start with one of my favourite slides. Every square that you see on screen represents 1 million tons of meat. Okay? So, let's have a look. The middle blob is humans. So, get all the humans in the world on the scales. That's how many million tons of meat we comprise. Okay? Now, up on the scales then I want to hop, what have we got next? Yeah, here we go. Cattle. Pigs. Goats. Sheep. Let's see what else we got. Horses, okay? So each square you're looking at is 1 million tons of meat, okay? So, it doesn't really matter what they all add up to. What you might have noticed so far is everything you've seen here is either a human or a farmed animal for humans, okay? So this is the world this is the weighing scales. Now, I want to now add in the vertebrate land-based wildlife, okay, into the slide for you. Come on, there are some there.
Disappeared altogether.
God, this slide has actually gotten worse since the last time I did it. Yeah, here we go. No, that's still filling in the other. Yeah, here we go. The wild animals. watch out for green, okay? So here's your elephants now. There's one square gone since I created the slide. So here you go. There, 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 and there, right? Oh, sorry, there's 2 squares over there, okay? So what you're looking at is the human planet. The replacement of a multiplicity of species by one species and its service animals. And why this is so important is that our footprint, our ecological footprint, has been massively multiplied by the animals that we produce for meat and for milk products. These animals and the impacts. Now, all the space that used to exist in the natural world has been displaced, the land cleared, primarily for agricultural production, and most of it forms of agricultural production that use up whales of space and are, as I'll show you, are extraordinarily inefficient at converting primary energy into food you put in your mouth. This is the main point that I'm making, is not just the size of this system, but its staggering inefficiency. Okay? So, now I'm going to do the cosmic weighing scales here, okay? So, you've seen the kind of overall slide. So, humans and our domestic animals outweigh all wild vertebrates by a factor of 42-fold. Okay, so this slide generally comes as a surprise to people, and I'm going to finish this section by putting the same slide up, but this time removing us and our animals and just leaving on screen wild nature. So as you can see, the most gigantic hole has been punched through the natural world, and this has happened geologically, it's in the blink of an eye. These changes on the entire living world, the whole natural world has changed beyond imagination, just like that, in a geological, as I say, heartbeat. So that's where we're at. Now, this of course is not a static situation. If I come back in 5 years and, we're still here and talking about this stuff, I'm going to be removing a few more of these squares. So that's just where we're at. So what I find staggering is just how little discussion and understanding there seems to be about this. I'm told it's understood. And yet, when you actually convert it into, say, a graphic, people go, holy shit. That's the general reaction. Well, at least I hope they do. This is a slight detour now and possibly going a little bit down Maureen's path. And this is about the personhood or otherwise of our fellow animals. And I emphasize our fellow animals. And maybe one of the reasons why we're so keen to deny them personhood and consciousness is that if they're people, they're embarrassingly better people than we are. They build better communities, they live at peace with themselves, and they aren't, unlike humans, actively psychopathic towards other species. They know and take account of a great deal more information about the natural world than we do. So, when people ask you, well, what's the difference between humans and animals? There's always an assumption that you're about to explain how much superior we are to our fellow animals. I think sometimes we're looking through the wrong end of the telescope here. If an alien, not connected to our species or any other species, rocked up to planet Earth, did an audit and handed in the results at the end, they would say, this species is psychopathic. It's the only description for it, actively psychopathic. So, other animals, I know National Geographic and so on, they like to emphasize conflict in nature. But the strange thing about nature is conflict happens at the fringes. Carnivores hunt to eat. They don't kill for fun. They don't even fight for fun. It's too risky. The only animal that fights for fun is us. The only animal that seems to get off on violence is us. So, as I say, we could do a whole 40 minutes on elephants. Right? There's a wonderful book, if anybody's interested in it, by a guy called Carl Safina, who specifically looks at elephant consciousness. He also looks at other animals, but it's primarily around elephant consciousness and elephant societies. The typical leader of an elephant community is a 60-year-old female. So there are matriarchies with levels of social bonding that would put most human societies to shame. So, anyway, I'll move on. This is the kind of stuff we see circuses and things doing with these highly intelligent sentient creatures, and people often wonder how do you get an elephant to ride a motorcycle or a tricycle like this? And this is the short answer, and I'm not going to do a whole session on this, but this is the short answer. You beat them and you brutalise them until they perform for you. So any circus, anything like that, it's dreadful. But anyway, I'm going to rock on. As I said, that's a different talk. So, as I mentioned, I'm trying to put numbers on this, and to put it into direct correlation, the way I often describe this is, especially if I'm talking in schools, I say by the time when I was a kid, there were twice as many wild animals in the world as there are as a middle-aged man. Just in that time. And usually a hand goes up at the back and says, "Sir, if that's the case, what's going to happen when I'm your age?" It's a hell of a question. And we're not addressing that question. And this is not a static situation. We're on a slope that is at about a 45-degree angle in terms of all these trends. So, anyway, I'm going to just turn that into a kind of a graphic that's a little more appealing, right? Just to look at some of the species that are under threat. We reckon 17,000 lions. Of course, every time I do one of these slide sets, I have to check when did I add this slide, because you come back and you say, shit, it's 14,000 lions. So anyway, so lion population decline. 90% of the world's lions are gone, say in this particular case in Ghana, in 40 years. Forest elephant population down 60%. Leatherback turtles down 95%. Particular species of dolphin 75%, etc., etc. Different whales. So this is happening all over the world, right in front of us, and huge reasons for this are our food choices. This is kind of, you might say, well, hang on, how did this guy sneak into the vegetarian society, right? Why does this matter? This matters enormously, because most of this carnage has been driven by our conscious food, or unconscious food choices. So, again, this is kind of repeating the same point. 1970 to 2010, global populations of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians declined by 52%. More than two-thirds of the essential services provided by nature rated to be in severe decline. Now, that's 70 to 2010. So I use a quote here from the WWF. That's not the wrestling people, it's the other guys, right? And this guy, I put it up, and I'll ask you why you think I put it up. He says, we're gradually destroying our planet's ability to support our way of life. And he's a guy representing wildlife. And he's having a pity cry for the planet's inability to continue to be thrashed by humans. Which I find fascinating, that this anthropocentric view is so deeply embedded that even the people claiming to represent wildlife can only talk in public in relation to how it affects humans, which is pretty staggering. It also shows what an extraordinary ego we have. Yeah. At one among 10, 20, 30, 40 million species, who knows? We haven't counted. So, as I mentioned, that's where we're at, but we're heading from 52% to 67%. Now, this particular slide is by 2020. This is what's called the Living Planet Index, shows vertebrate populations set to decline by 67% on 1970 levels. See what I mean? The baseline is moving all the time. So from my earlier slides, you see the next wave. You get back to that again in 2020 and see where it's at. So it's moving pretty fast. So the next slide, I call it, I suppose, a zero-sum game. This is go on out of that. Yeah, this is kind of humans and extinction crises. So I'm going to show you two axes here. We have extinctions and we have human population. And you'll see there's a pretty direct correlation to the two axes. This is starting from 1800 and travelling upwards. So the human population is here and extinctions in green here. And as you can see, the correlation is pretty close. And of course, it isn't just about increased population. For example, one or two wealthy Irish people have the ecological footprint of probably 500 or 600 sub-Saharan Africans. So I think it's very important to always remember that it's very popular in the Western world to shout, population, population. If only those Africans would stop having so many babies, but then all these crises would be solved. The problem is resources and the unfair, increasingly unfair distribution and allocation of resources. So I'm going to cut to the meat, as they say here, right? So this is our little symbolised critter. This is the global cow, and you break it up into different slices from climate change to rainforest destruction to water depletion, deforestation, nitrous oxide, methane, etc., etc. Okay, it's a whole bunch of stuff. And as I said in my introduction, I found myself in conflict a lot in Ireland with the farming lobby, because obviously we have, as Maureen said, a staggeringly large population. In fact, she understated it. She mentioned 6.7 million cattle. It's now 7.4 million cattle. We've added 330,000 dairy cows since 2015. So, as I say, the baselines keep shifting. And they're having an extraordinary effect. So I'm going to go through this quickly. Okay, so this is an opening position I'm going to take from the Chatham House Report 2016. Without a significant reduction in global meat eating, keeping global warming below 2 degrees will be nearly impossible. So tackling unsustainable meat consumption is therefore a necessity. So this is where climate change and food intersect more precisely, probably than any other metric. People say, well, think about climate change, I should do a little more of this, a little more of that. The single largest driver, as I'm going to show you, is actually diet. And I think you probably got that sense from that opening slide of all the creatures in the world. Assuming that we're wide enough or big enough or open enough as people to recognise the right of other creatures to exist in the world, which I hope we are. At least some of us are. So this slide is looking at researchers calculating that to rein in meat consumption to the recommended levels. So if humans only ate the medically recommended amount of meat in their diets, we could cut agricultural emissions of greenhouse gases globally by almost 30%. So if we didn't overeat meat, we could reduce agricultural emissions by a third. If we had a global shift to a vegetarian diet, emissions would come down by 2/3, which also eases ecological problems from deforestation, desertification, eutrophication, and water stress. Okay? And these are all the pressures of massive animal agriculture. And this also frees land available to grow food directly for humans. And the corollary of that, of course, is the other thing we need to free land for in the world, more than anything else, is nature. It's reckoned that at least a half of the world's land surface needs to be simply given back to nature, to have no further human involvement with at least half the world's land surface. And people will say, well, that's crazy, I want to farm it, I want to dig mines out of it and stuff. If we don't make that space available for natural systems, then those natural systems are no longer going to be able to function. And I suppose, to me, one of the ones that's always worth reflecting on is, you think of the gases in the air that we breathe, right? Primarily it's nitrogen, which is no use to us. But the one, obviously, that we're all utilising right now is oxygen, which is about 21% of the air in this room is oxygen. Oxygen is not a naturally occurring gas on planet Earth. Oxygen only occurs as a byproduct of the respiration of plants and land and in the ocean. It is a byproduct of photosynthesis. And the reason, I know, apologies if that's a statement of the bleeding obvious, but if we're cutting down the forests and destroying the ocean's ability to respire, pretty soon that 21% oxygen isn't going to be 21%. If you clear the forests that produce as a byproduct of their activity the oxygen that we breathe, we're going to suffocate, all of us. There is no way of replacing it. There's no machine. There's no inhale. Well, actually there is. You can have bottled oxygen, sure. All of us, forever. This is the kind of Mad Max situation that we're heading for. We're destroying the systems that produce the oxygen that we breathe, that we require minute by minute to be alive. As I said, oxygen is not a naturally occurring gas. It is a byproduct of natural processes that we are destroying, which to me has got to be the cosmic own goal of all times. But I digress. I'll move on. So, getting people to understand this is the hard bit. Okay? So I'm going to, again, let's go back to my Chatham House report, which I quite liked, and I wrote a very long, have I gone too far? Sorry, very long Irish Times article about this about 2 years ago that upset a lot of people, well, a lot of people in the farming sector. And here it is. It says consumers with a higher level of awareness. In other words, once consumers, once the public, I hate the phrase consumers, once the public get the connections, the ecological, the climate connections to their dietary habits, they're more willing to reduce meat and dairy consumption for climate objectives. But the problem is there's this massive awareness gap, and that's the first step. And they did make the point there's a striking paucity of efforts to rein in consumption of these high-intensity products. And governments and environmental groups, and interesting this, by the way, if you kind of look at Greenpeace or look at all these environmental organisations, they're forever talking about the fossil fuel. You know how the demons of the fossil fuel industry, and they are, by the way, they're devils, and most of them should be in jail from what they knew and what they've done. However, globally, the large meat and dairy producers, in terms of impacts, in terms of climate impacts, and also in terms of the devastation of the natural world, they're right up there. And yet they get almost a free pass because they go, oh, food. You know, don't criticise us, we produce food. And obviously food being produced in exactly the way we want, you can't criticise, it's sacrosanct. And that's a mistake because there's lots of different ways to produce food. Ireland, as a little tangent, for example, we have the second lowest area in the European Union producing organic food. Second lowest. And the lowest in the European Union area given over to horticulture. Imagine this. Origin Green, the green Ireland, the island of greenness. Second lowest in organics and the lowest in horticulture. So our green island is a marketing myth, a fantasy, paid for 55 million a year, paid by the taxpayer to Bord Bia to spread this fantasy, which is essentially a marketing device to promote the beef and dairy sectors, which are private sectors, I should add. So, anyway, you can see why they love me. Wow. But isn't it funny how these assumptions, they just sit there. But, sure, everybody knows we're great at food production. We're a net importer of food calories on the island of Ireland. We import the calories for the food for 2.4 million people more than we export the food calories for. When you take gross calories, which includes the embedded energy in food. And as you go up the food chain into beef and dairy production, the embedded energy, the fossil energy, is colossal. The nitrates, the phosphates, and so on, is colossal. Okay? So, I come back to this again. Left unchecked, let's say we say the hell with it, we'll just keep going. Global meat and dairy consumption will rise by 76% compared with current levels, according to the UN Food and Agriculture. And I've described this as a lethal double whammy for human health and the biosphere. As we looked at earlier, right, cast your mind back to that opening slide. Now, try and fit in another 76% more cattle, 76% more sheep, 76% more goats, and say to yourself, well, what the devil is left? And how? And how do we do this in anything other than the agricultural version of satanic mills, of intensifying agricultural production? I grew up, by the way, on a farm. I'm a farmer's son. Like so many people, I'm a former farmer, if you like so many people in Ireland. So, I have kind of very much two takes on this. But I do recognise that intensive agriculture is, it's not good. So, now I'm going to talk for a second about beef specifically, because beef is a very special product, okay? First of all, it has, I call it the SUV of food, right? It has the lowest feed-to-food conversion efficiencies of any commonly produced food. So, 1% of gross cattle feed energy and 4% of ingested proteins from where you start with ends up in your burger. So you have a 99% loss of efficiency. Now, I've been starting to grow some food recently. It's a novelty for a former farmer, and not driving around a tractor, but growing spuds and stuff, right? You grow a spud, you stick it in the ground, a few months later, out it comes, you pop it in a pot, you eat it, and so on. The energy conversion involved there is staggeringly efficient. You put in almost no external inputs, maybe a little bit of manure. You take it out and you convert that potato or that carrot or that whatever into energy that you can use directly. If you filter that through a piece of beef, you will lose 99% of the energy involved along the way. And that's why we have a global food crisis. We're picking the most inefficient possible way. And that's why the world is covered in cattle and why we have levelled rainforests to produce not just cattle, but to produce soybeans and other things to feed cattle, to feed us cheap burgers. Because, as you know, we have a right to cheap meat, apparently.
I think in the stat on that, like, it takes about 7 kilograms of plants for one to produce half a kilo of beef.
That's way higher. Way
Is it
higher.
really?
Oh yeah, way higher. The actual plant to beef conversion is way higher. Yeah, I mean, they're like cattle are extremely. They're very efficient at being cattle, right? So in their own terms, they're very efficient. And cattle, by the way, are very intelligent, sociable creatures. We just treat them, in a way that doesn't allow that to happen. But leaving that aside, they're very efficient at being cattle, but they're incredibly inefficient at being food for us. So I'm not even blaming them for that. It's not their fault. Okay, so here's a quick overview, calibrated against kilometres in quaint old car kilometres. This is before electric cars. This is just regular car kilometres. So have a quick look at that. So diet without meat and dairy products, if you like. Organic and conventional. These are impacts in terms of the equivalent, types of diets per person per year representing car kilometres. So essentially, pile in the conventional meat and dairy products, and you get a sense. What this is about is high impact living, okay? And you can see it there visually very, very clearly, that if you make a choice to go down the vegan or flexitarian route, I think a lot of us, myself included, I'm not a vegetarian, I'm a flexitarian. I mostly eat PVC cables. I'll come back to that one. So anyway, but I'm moving towards, as my family are, towards vegetarianism, right? For climate reasons and also for animal welfare reasons, because the more you look into this, you're looking into a house of horror. And I guess, we got a little dog at home. We got him about 3 years ago for the kids. And just say, I wonder will we eat him? Because I'm really hungry and he's made of meat. Nobody wants to eat the dog, strangely. He's certainly not smarter than a pig. He's very adorable, but he's not especially smart. But we have chosen not to eat him, even when sometimes you come in the evening and you're starving. But we still haven't yet cut him up and eaten him. And it is slightly facetious, but a serious point. Once we bond and connect with our fellow animals, then the idea of doing that to them is monstrous. And if you saw somebody stick a knife into a dog, you'd call the cops, right? And we're doing this on an industrial scale with animals that are every bit as smart, every bit as cute once you get to know them. But I'm digressing again. I'm supposed to be here talking about climate change. So anyway, this is actually from a scientific source quite recently, and again, it's just reiterating the points I've made. Going veggie would cut global food emissions by 2/3 and save millions of lives. And by the way, I guess they meant human lives. I'd like to throw in billions of lives, and also create space on a very finite planet. We have to decide who gets the space. And as I hope I showed fairly clearly early on, we're crowding out nature, taking all its space, taking all its stuff, and wiping it out in the process. And I think, to be alive, to be a human alive now, is a weird position and a strange responsibility. The old Chinese saying / curse, may you live in interesting times. We live in interesting times. So, and of course, none of this is happening against a stable background, like the human population, for example, which is, again, one of the factors, is increasing at the rate of... Does anybody know, for example, we're currently at about 7.5 billion. Does anybody know how long it takes to add 1 billion humans on our current trajectory, which, by the way, has flattened off dramatically over the last, say, 20 years? Would anybody hazard a multiplier for our next billion people? From 7.5 to 8.5, how long would that take?
5 years.
5? A little bit aggressive. Any other takers?
30 years.
13. Yeah. The last billion we did in 12. This one is slightly slower, 13. Right? So, 1 billion. And remember, we went from 200 and whatever thousand years of humans. We hit our first billion in 1840. Okay? So, we're currently adding a billion approximately every 13 years. So, we're into a hyper-exponential phase of human growth, shall we say. So here's a little detour into some of my friends from the Farmers Journal. And this one mentioned a front page lead story recently pointing out that there would be no climate tax on cattle. And I'll zoom it up here a little bit so hopefully you can read it. And Professor Fitzgerald, who's he's an economist by trade, and he's the chairman of the Climate Change Advisory Council, which is the group that are tasked to advise the government on what to do about this. Now, for those of you who follow these things, you remember we had a Citizens' Assembly about abortion? We all know what happened. We had a joint Oireachtas committee, took the Citizens' Assembly's report's findings, and voila, the Eighth Amendment, right? We also had a Citizens' Assembly report, which they met in November of last year, attended the whole process, and they asked 99 members of the public, locked into a hotel room for a weekend, only accessed by experts, no lobbyists allowed in the room, right? Just like with the Eighth Amendment, right? No lobbyists, just experts. They said, right, we want to talk to you about climate change, and at the end of the weekend, we want your recommendations. What do we do? So they came out with 13 recommendations, almost unanimous, okay? And the recommendations were more radical than any government has ever in the history of Ireland suggested in terms of climate action. And among those recommendations were that they all supported, I think it was 97% of them supported, carbon taxes on high carbon food, with the recommendation that the foods be ring fenced, that the carbon taxes be ring fenced to support low carbon foods, organic foods, horticulture, etc. Right? Which at the moment get a really hard time. You go down to Lidl or Aldi or whatever, and you can pick up a bag of carrots for 40 cents. Right? How does any horticulturalist compete with that type of market distortions? So, anyway, just I never let Professor Fitzgerald away without at least one little dig here. He said, I'll just get this now. He said he rejected the Citizens' Assembly's proposal to extend such a tax to livestock. We certainly haven't suggested a carbon tax. Right? So, the Citizens' Assembly, the people who brought us the Eighth Amendment, recommended this. But the economics professor says no. Why is that? I kind of scratch my head and wonder why that was. Then I realise this is why it is. Don't know how bad or good that slide is. Anyway, that is a room full of IFA lobbyists working their TDs, county by county. Right? This is a €10 million a year lobbying organisation, and that's just the IFA. You've got the agri-industrial industry, €8 billion, big businesses, transnational corporations, CEOs earning €4.5 million, and all they want to come out of the Irish agricultural system is shit cheap food, beef and dairy, and tons of it. Right? By the way, great news, we're the world's second largest exporter of powdered milk to the growing market for Chinese breast milk replacement. So this is what we're doing with Origin Green. We're taking our milk production, powderising it, and selling it to people while using marketing to convince them that they should use Irish cow's milk in preference to breast milk. And this, by the way, is progress. And we, the taxpayer, the European taxpayer, subsidises Irish agriculture to the tune of 1.8 billion a year, and the Irish taxpayer throws in hundreds of millions more. We pay for this madness. Irish dairies, for example, are now undercutting African farmers and dumping cheap dairy products into the African markets and pushing African farmers to the wall. Because an African farmer, like a pint of milk in sub-Saharan Africa is really expensive because they have small herds, and so the farmer relies on getting a good price for the pint of milk. We're now dumping Irish and European subsidised milk into their markets, basically increasing their poverty. So just a headline I saw from one of the European Union journals asking whether meat is the new climate change in terms of denial and our inability to accept the consequences that go with it. So one of the other trends with meat production is concentration, and this is hardly news, but I'll try and just show it to you in terms of a slide. Yeah. So this slide will show you the percentage of the market held by the four largest corporations. Okay, so 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010. So fewer and fewer corporations controlling more and more of the market. What does that do? That turns the primary producer, the farmer, is being turned into a price taker. All the power is accumulating with the mega producers, and the farmers are getting screwed over. But they're still useful as political pawns, as they're used in Ireland, to actually apply pressure to the government to continue policies that support the mega producers. Some farmers are beginning to figure this out. And of course, this is also happening in a backdrop in which the climatic conditions, even in a temperate country like Ireland, for agricultural production are absolutely souring. I mean, I've spoken to numerous farmers this year, and these are guys who've been farming for 50 years, and they said they've never experienced the kind of climate and weather disruption that they've had over the last 12, 18, 24 months. From flood to drought, they don't know when to plant, they don't know when to sow, they're in a state of absolute despair, and they've been told nothing about this, absolutely nothing. I was part of a delegation on Monday last that went to meet Met Éireann, to ask Met Éireann, politely, would you mind, pretty please, talking to the Irish public about the underlying climate signal that is altering the weather conditions in Ireland? And they're going, well, that's not our job. We just talk about the weather. Now, to me, that's a very political decision if you decide, knowing that the climate signal is changing, and because of the changing climate signal, the weather is changing with it and getting much more radical, then we need to talk to people about this, because we need to prepare our agricultural system for extreme weather events. For example, like you mentioned, Maureen, earlier about the 7.4 million beef cattle and cows on the island. People say we have a fodder shortage. No, we don't. We have too many bloody cattle. We have way too many cattle. We don't have enough land producing enough grass on this island to feed 7.4 million cattle. These animals are enormous. These are huge animals, weighing close to a ton each. And we've got 7.4 million of them wandering around. We don't have enough grass. The island isn't big enough. So what are we going to do? Where's the political will to tackle that?
This is Origin Green are pushing this thing that grass-fed. We have all the grass-fed. Everything is, all the cattle are grass-fed, which is it's not true.
It's a lie.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're importing soy from South America to feed our Origin Green cattle. Sorry.
Yeah, that because people keep saying, as a vegetarian, I eat soy, while they're eating local food, which is beef, and they're eating grass. So I need data in terms of how much soy is actually being eaten by cattle.
Next time they say that to them, you can tell them that your locally grown Origin Green beef is being fed by Venezuelan or whatever South American soy. Yeah. And we're clearing rainforests in South and Central America to produce food, to ship it across the Atlantic, to feed it into cattle, to have a 99% efficiency loss, to turn it into beef at the other end. Crazy system. The system wouldn't exist if we didn't subsidise it to the hilt. We're not doing a history lesson, but if we were, a lot of this springs from the Second World War, where in Europe there was a actual hunger, starvation after the war. And the European economic community, one of the things was a cheap food policy. But that cheap food policy has outlived its usefulness by a huge distance. So I'll truck on, guys, okay? So this is the process of processing animals, right? So just have a look at the slide. So here. So raising animals on Earth uses 45% of the Earth's total land area. There's nothing else uses. That's the total area of land on Earth. So effectively a half of all the Earth's land is used, right? 1 to 2 acres of rainforest cleared per second. 55%, here we go. Factory farming produced more than 50% of the food animals in the US. Again, 60% of corn. So the point is the corn and the soybeans in the US, they're not feeding people. They're feeding animals to produce cheap beef. And the US government subsidises the hell out of this as well. Takes money from taxpayers, hands it to corporations like Cargill to produce super cheap beef, because apparently, like super cheap petrol, it's the American way. And they've exported that overconsumption of beef all over the world. 150 billion animals a year slaughtered for food. Livestock and the effects of dead zones, and it's reckoned now, there are different figures for this, This one suggests animal agriculture being responsible for 51% of greenhouse gas emissions. I wouldn't agree with that figure. The more commonly stated figure, say through the IPCC, is probably something of the region of 14.5%. But it depends. If, for example, you add in the deforestation that leads to the clearance for food production, you end up, when you do the multiples, you can end up with a figure approaching that. But it's a massive, the way our food production systems, if it was designed by a crazy person trying to wipe us out, we would design our food systems the way we've designed them. And I'm sure they haven't been designed by crazy people who are trying to wipe us out. Just making that point rhetorically. So, to take a vegan analogy, because this particular graphic is from a vegan source, you know, a person who eats a vegan diet would save lots of water, lots of primary food, lots of forest, lots of CO2, and obviously lots of animals. And I suppose the life of the animal, I think there's life and there's what they call in medical terms qualies, which is like quality of life. Now, to me, like, we're all going to die, all animals die, and in the natural world, it's totally normal for herbivores to be killed by carnivores. So let's not be, squeamish about this. But this is the unnatural world.
There was an article recently in The Guardian that stated that veganism, I don't agree with this, by the way, basically it stated that veganism wasn't that great for the environment because people switch from eating meat to eating like imported avocados and stuff like that.
Yep.
What would your response be to that?
I would completely agree. If, for example, if we're flying in cut flowers from Nigeria into the European markets, right, which is completely crazy, right?
Yeah.
Yet you might say, well, God, that's great, they're producing flowers instead of producing beef in Nigeria. No. You have to be really careful of solving one problem, closing one door and opening another door. And I think you're right. If you switch to a vegan diet that then has you importing nuts and things from all over the world, you're missing the point. What you want to switch to is a vegan diet that is largely locally based and seasonal food. Just like every generation of humans, by the way, ate locally and seasonally. Every generation up until about 2 or 3 generations ago. And if any of you have watched the wonderful movie Black 47, no?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody.
Well,
Oh, you have? Okay, one person, yeah. You get to see how close we are to a very vegetarian-only system. A very risky system, of course, but very much a, shall we say, that was a vegetarian monoculture, which was a disaster in itself, but that's another day's story. So I'm going to take a quick step back. I hope I'm okay. Am I doing all right time-wise?
probably wrap it up very soon, yeah.
Yeah.
A little bit of it.
All right. Okay. This is a quick, scary slide. There's too much detail for you to see it, but don't worry. This is called the Great Acceleration. This is what's happened on Earth since 1950. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in so you can see it a bit better. Doesn't matter too much in the details. Everything, just watch left to right. 1750 to the current day, right? Population, GDP, river damming, water use, foreign direct investment, atmospheric CO2, fertilizer consumption, ozone depletion, atmospheric nitrous oxide, atmospheric methane, average surface temperatures, flooding events, decline in ocean ecosystems, coastal structures, amount of domesticated land, loss of tropical rainforests and woodlands, and so on. So, a few other things like paper consumption, motor vehicles, and telephones. Now, this line here is 1950. That's the line that many scientists have identified as the moment that the Great Acceleration kicked off. It's an arbitrary date, but it's after the Second World War when the consumer society was created, right? And everything, all that hyper period, and we've picked a random about 24 different matrices to just point out this isn't one thing. It isn't like there's this one problem that we're having with this one solution. This is an overall assault, an unintended assault on the basis of life on Earth by an exuberantly creative, energetic, talented bunch of humans who are clearing the face of the Earth without even thinking about it and converting that into profit, into revenue in the shorter term. Along the way, by the way, I could switch into my Steven Pinker mode. I could take all these charts and invert them and tell you how much better humans have done over the last 200 years. And by the way, I'd be right. But I'm not sure that valuing or judging human progress without looking at the cost of human progress is very helpful, because if human progress is built on an unsustainable edifice, then human progress is in for the mother and father of all corrections. So, I wonder what a correction of human progress might look like. So, I'm sure you've all seen this, but bear with me anyway, okay? This slide takes us back 12,000 years to the end of the last ice age. Now, we've got records that go back 800,000 years. So what we know, for example, in them is that in the 800,000 years for which we have detailed physical records of carbon dioxide, which is the critical greenhouse gas, in the deepest glacial period, typically carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would be at about 170, 180 parts per million. And in the interglacials, it has never exceeded 280 parts per million. So our band of life for the last 800,000 years, for which we have a continuous physical record from Antarctic ice cores, never below 170, never above 280. Now within that band of about 100 parts per million, you go from, in Ireland for example, being under 1 or 2 kilometres of ice to the current climate. So that's how much happens in that band. Now, and that's basically what it looks like. And strangely enough, just before the current era, we were in a cooling period, a natural cooling period. Okay? So this little red bit is the heat, the additional heat that humans have added over the last 100 years, which translates into about 1 degree centigrade. Okay? Follow that line over here. But it's already taken us out of anything we've experienced since the end of the Ice Age. So you've probably seen charts like this at different times. What's really important is time and scale here. So I'm going to roll the tape forward to the end of the 21st century, which is now between 50 and 80 years out. So just the remaining 50, 60 years. And this is under business as usual. In other words, if we continue simply doing what we're doing right now, no major changes, no major increases, no major reductions, just roughly the same. Which, by the way, means we're going to have to be a lot more efficient because we're going to have a lot more people and so on. But anyway. Okay, now, at the moment, the optimists say we're here, but in reality, we're most likely there, right? Now, just remember, the difference, say, between this and 3, this way, is 2 kilometres of ice over your head, okay? So you've got to try and imagine we're already in an interglacial. What happens when we get from here to there to there, okay? This century, for sure. Now, the most common one reckoned is 5 degrees, right? And 5 degrees centigrade temperature increase, net temperature increase. And by the way, just so you understand what I mean by 5 degrees, that isn't just the land. That is the surface temperature of the Earth, which means the surface temperature of the water, which covers 70% of the Earth. For example, in Arctic regions, that 5 degrees is more likely to be 20 degrees or 25 degrees. And what does 25 degrees do in an Arctic region? It melts all the ice. We move out of what's called the cryosphere. This is the Earth in its ice phase. Now, we've been in an ice phase for a very long time. We've had major glaciers. We have an ice cap at the pole and a very large land-based ice cap in Antarctica, plus some other land-based glaciers, the biggest one obviously being Greenland. Under the scenario I've just shown you, we're committed to there not being a cube of ice on Earth, anywhere on Earth. None. It's impossible, other than one manufactured by a human using a refrigeration system. That's the level of change involved in 5 degrees. And by the way, a whole bunch of other stuff that really is, you know, it's Dante-esque is the best way to describe it. And the weird thing is, the politicians, the policymakers, Leo Varadkar, Simon Coveney, they know this stuff. They know this is where we're heading. And yet, what's more important is humouring the various lobbyists and all the business as usual people. Business as usual is taking us over a cliff and it's going to kill an awful lot of people. So, this is just a comment from a atmospheric specialist, and he put it very well. He said, it's difficult to overestimate the scale and speed of change. In a single lifetime, humanity has become a planetary scale geological force. We're a larger geological force than any other natural force anywhere on Earth. And one of my heroes is a former professor of the Natural History Museum in London. He put it in a slightly different way. He said, I think we're a failed species. Our lives are so artificial they can't possibly be sustained within the limits of our planet. And from the planet's point of view, it would be delighted for humans to become extinct, and the sooner it happens, the better. Now, if the animals got to vote, I think they would probably elect this guy as their spokesperson and say he's got a point. But it's a weird thing. If humans are let, or if we continue on our current path, we're going to effectively end life on Earth, probably this century. And that is certainly guaranteed that humans will go extinct this century. Guaranteed. So it's a curious thing. We're caught in this strange dilemma that nobody talks about. Anyway, you have to be optimistic, though. And he does point out that he said the good news is that life will return on the planet and will recover, and peace will return to the environment. The problem is it's going to take millions of years. The shit pile that we've left is going to take millions of years to clear. The oceans, for example, are already so severely damaged that probably we won't get returned to the conditions of the ocean, say, 500 years ago for at least 5 million years, unfortunately. And it's quite likely that we could, in fact, end up by mid-century, this century, with jellyfish being pretty much the only thing in the oceans. We're simplifying and downgrading and degrading and polluting the oceans to the point where a complete cascading failure of our marine systems is on the cards. And as I mentioned earlier, 2/3 of our oxygen is generated by photosynthesis at sea. So that's not so good. Anyway, this is one of my favourite. I'm going to finish up with this. This is one of my favourite graphics. It was from the Guardian newspaper, which, as you know, is not a whinging left-wing rag. It's more of a whinging right-wing rag. But anyway, and this was their Earth Day cartoon from last year, right? And you see up here, the guy driving it is got his head stuck in the sand of denial. And it's sort of interesting, the machine he's in, the wheels of it are habitat destruction. The exhaust pipe is global warming, which I think is a great way to think about this. Global warming is often thought about as if it was the process in itself. It's not. It's the exhaust pipe of this human machine driven on raided resources, overpopulation, ejecting pollution into the system and converting complexity into simplicity, and not in a good way. So, we could talk about rainforests and things like that as well, but I mean, I'll finish up then maybe with just one quick slide on rainforest clearance, which we're looking at the moment. 6,000 acres an hour, about 50 million acres a year, and as I mentioned earlier, much of our oxygen has been produced by that. And how do you price these things? We have market failures all over the system. So, I don't know if I have sound here, but if I do, this is to lighten the mood a little bit. This is one of my favourite little clips. This guy goes to the doctor. Let's see if I have it up. It's very, very brief. So the 3 stages of grief. Here we go.
We have had your test results. May I be blunt with you?
No.
Right. Well, everything is fine. You're not going to die.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Right. Bye.
Okay. Thank you all. Cheers. If you have time for questions, happy to field them.
Just to say, this is a great presentation, thanks, Mel. But I'm aware of a lot of this stuff.
Sure.
And as you say, there's a whole lot of awareness out there. But what can you and I do apart from change? How many medias are in the room? Do you know what I mean? You're kind of preaching to the converted here.
Sure.
And where do we go? What do we do apart from change our own diets?
Okay. It's a good question. My honest answer is that what we do for individually to square our own ethical positions, I think that's everybody's decision. But what I say to people when they ask that very question is, get political. It's a political problem, right? Get protesting. Join organisations, environmental organisations, but join ones that are radical rather than ones that are trying to suck up the government for funding, right? And basically demand that our government, we can only do what we can do, but Ireland is a disproportionately heavy hitter. We're the second or third worst emitter per capita of carbon in the entire European Union. Now, this is the European Union with lots of coal mines and lots of smelting going on. We're almost uniquely bad at this. So I would say we have to start at home, we have to act, we have to get our own house in order. And I guess for folks like me, what keeps this on the front burner for me is that everything is at stake here. Anybody under the age of 50, is going to live through much of what I've described. None of us get out of this intact. And anybody who's got a stake in the future, which I reckon is all of us, right? This is what's coming. And from, I guess, my presentation is possibly a little bit on the blunt side, because we've tried, and I've been to loads of environmental things where they say the most important thing is to get the messaging right. Bring people with you. Don't frighten the horses, right? We've done that for 30 years. 30 years of environmentalism without frightening the horses has led to what exactly? Everything I've just described. The collapse of the biosphere, the death of the natural world. So as far as I'm concerned, environmentalism that isn't radical isn't environmentalism. We face a radical situation. So to react in a non-radical way to a radical situation. If your house is on fire, it is not rational to be calm. You're in a crisis, you've got to react, and you've got to move quickly. We're in a crisis, our house is on fire, and we're all sitting around going, fire is good. It's a little bit warmer in the house than it was, 5 years ago. I like that. Well, actually, the basement's on fire, right? And that's the situation that we find ourselves in. The basement is on fire, and we're beginning to get the fumes, we can smell it. I think, could I ask the question, and it's probably a loaded question given what I've said, how many people in the room sense that the climate is changing around them? Okay, and thank you. If you didn't and you're just being polite, thank you also. So I do think this is approaching the visceral point. I've been at this for years, and it's so difficult trying to explain to folks in Ireland, in a temperate climate, that this shit is going down. Because they go, that is not my lived experience. And until your lived experience tallies with my scary charts, then you will resist my scary charts, because it doesn't tally with your lived experience. But right across the so-called developing world, their lived experience is, there is no climate denial, by the way, in the developing world. In Africa, across Asia, in South America, there is no such thing as climate denial. Climate denial is something that mostly old white men engage in Britain, in Ireland, in North America, and in Australia. But the rest of the world is just saying, shit, we've got a problem, what do we do about it? But unfortunately, those old white men happen to be the ones that are controlling the levers of most of the most powerful organisations on earth, including the US government. But sorry, I'm babbling too much. Anybody else like to get in?
Just one quick question.
Yeah.
I'm from India, and I'm like a vegetarian my whole life, so I've never had meat and anything. You were saying that we should move towards vegetarianism and veganism, but we should focus on locally sourced food rather than importing it.
Where possible, yeah.
Yeah, but how do you challenge the struggle of places where the population density is too high, like in Japan, maybe in Ireland, the climate is not that good. You can't grow that much variety of food here.
We supported 8 million people on this island.
No, I'm saying that you can't grow a variety of food here because it's mostly cold here.
Yeah, okay. Right. In other words, we can't have pineapples and so on. I'm not suggesting that there won't be international trade, but I'm suggesting that the core of our diets have to be a lot simpler, and that international traded goods should be supplementary, not at the moment. It is avocado. For example, I opened my fridge the other day and I took out an apple. It's September. The apple's from New Zealand. Sorry.
Just add to that quickly, there are some things that are being developed now, like vertical grow houses and these kind of artificial ways that you can grow food outside of climates, using hydroponic systems and stuff like that mean that you can grow food like that in a sort of artificial climate that's better for the environment than it would be in import it.
Sorry, can I just add one thing? When you were saying about what can we do about it, I think as much as people we can get in, we already changed our diets. The thing is, lots of misinformation are out there, and lots of the disinformation, like I didn't know as well, and I am worried about that as well. So it's just to get the information out there, because we are the demand as much as people we can get in. So I guess what we could do is activism. Something we could do very strongly, because if you change the demand, we are going to change that as well.
Yeah. Activism.
One tiny example. The hazel is a native to Ireland. It's a pest. It's all over the place. You can't contain the growth. And yet we're using almond milk instead of hazel milk.
Yeah, crazy.
I think that very much connects to what you say as well about the fact that I think one of the big issue at the moment is lots of people have lost the connection with nature and normal things. Like I grew up on the farm as well, and I know what is in season, and you talk with people and there's this connection that is missing.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the difficulty as well, in kind of getting back to understand the basic of what is normal and what isn't. You know?
Yeah. 150 years ago, everybody was a farmer, barring 1 or 2% of people. Everybody was a farmer. My prediction is by mid-century, everybody who's left will be a farmer. And food production will be back where it always was, the primary thing. And what every animal spends its day organising around food, shelter, but mostly food. Humans too. We've broken that cycle. And unfortunately, in many ways, brilliant ways, but unfortunately, in breaking the cycle, we've also broken the planet. And that's a shame. You know, and if somebody said to me, well, if I had a magic wand, what would I do? I would invent a time machine that brought me back 40 years ago, back 40 years, to start solving those problems 40 years ago. Unfortunately, I don't have that. So we find ourselves in a really difficult position now. But I do think it's really equally important to finish by saying that despair is as useless as denial when it comes to these large challenges. It's so easy for all of us to feel overwhelmed. I feel occasionally overwhelmed by this stuff. I really do. But you get up, you get back in the saddle, and you keep on and doing what you can do. Because, as often been said, the only thing that's ever changed anything in the world are small groups of determined people talking truth to power and refusing to let go on it. There's a 15-year-old Swedish kid at the moment. She's been on strike outside the Swedish Parliament for the last month or so. And she's saying, basically, the adults are trying to kill me. She said she's aware of climate change, and she said, I refuse to go back to school until the Swedish government gets serious about this. So she said, what am I going to school for? My future is being destroyed. And I think that kind of out-of-the-box thinking, and I was in with a group of TYs recently, and I used the example of her to say, don't feel helpless. We can do this, maybe. Now, it's going to be tough as hell, but if we don't try, then failure is guaranteed. So what's there to lose by giving it our best shot? We're going to fail 100% if we don't try. So, hey, what's not to try? So that's my optimism, if I can finish on that. All right, thanks a million.